Good morning, everybody. It's nice to see you. It's nice to be here. I think this course is very important for the day and age that we're living in, to really get a biblical view of what is our role as Christians in society, what is our roles as Christians in terms of social justice, and particularly in times with social conflict that we have, not just in South Africa, but internationally. We need to understand this and we need to be at the forefront of this. Now, I'm going to place a disclaimer straight up front. I'm not a theologian, okay? So, but I am a Christian and I'm an economist. Now, I've been told that putting those two words together never works, right? I've actually been told that Christians aren't economists because economists are evil. Economists believe in the bottom line and they don't have a heart, they don't have a soul, and they don't believe in justice, right? And I think what I'd like to show you today is maybe that's not true. Because I think Christians need to speak into economic issues and economic justice issues. And not just Christians need to speak into it, we need to be at the forefront, right? And I think we have a lot to say from a biblical perspective on what should happen in the economy. But for that to happen, we also need to understand what's happening around us. So today I'm going to talk to us about what does the economy look like in South Africa, and particularly from a socio-economic perspective. So I'm not going to show you exchange rates and interest rates and such things. I'm going to show you a picture and you might be a bit shocked, okay, about exactly what this picture of South Africa's economy is today. Because as we're going to see, it's one of the most fragmented economies. And if you think of, we're talking about social conflict, a lot of that might be rooted in the fragmented economic space, okay? Now the question is what influences what? Is it the economic space that's resulting in social fragmentation, or did it start with social fragmentation that led to economic fragmentation? And are these reinforcing each other, right? And is this some sort of self-reinforcing loop that we can break? So just to start off, South Africa is one of the most economically unequal societies in the world. Fact. Okay, that's a fact. So the most recent estimates that we have here is that 10% of the population owns 90 to 95% of the wealth. That's my shock statistic to open up this for you. And this is the context that we live in, right? So we're sitting here in Franschhoek beneath a beautiful mountain, one of the richest towns in the country. And often this beauty makes us maybe forget what other people are experiencing, okay? And we need to be faced with that reality. Also, just in terms of incomes, it's a similar figure. 10% earns 60% of the wages in the labor market. And clearly you can see that this isn't just something economic, it's something that's deeply socially divided, right? So at the beginning of this month, President Zuma gave his State of the Nation address, and it goes about the economy, right? And his big buzzword in this State of the Nation address was the emphasis on the need for radical economic transformation. And it's based exactly on this, that there's this really skewed distribution of resources. If there's a skewed distribution of resources, how do you maintain a social fabric? And so most policymakers would tell you, well, the root is in solving the economic issues, right? I think as a Christian, I would say that's not the only route, of course. We need to address the spiritual roots of it. And that's why I think I'm going to discuss also a bit the history of where a lot of this came from, okay? Just in terms of the legislation of how this started happening. So the main thrust of post-apartheid economic policy has been to address some of these issues. But policymakers have been accused of what is being called neoliberal market-friendly policies, which is friendly to those top 10% and not friendly to the bottom 90%. So it's market friendly, it helps people make more money, and it's this old adage, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Right, and that's what this accusation where I say neoliberal is, right? So the opposite of neoliberal might be socialist. Okay, I'm going to leave the political scientists to distinguish between those, but if you just remember that the accusation has been that South Africa has been market friendly and it hasn't allowed for transformation. It hasn't allowed for the poor to be uplifted relative to the rich population. So essentially, it's not pro-poor and it's not inclusive. These are also two buzzwords that we need to keep in mind. I don't know if anybody has been following a lot of the social conflict in the media. Particularly, I want to refer to the Fees Must Fall movement. It's a student-led movement, as most of you would know, and it's highlighted this concept of white privilege. Okay, white privilege. And white privilege isn't something that was invented in South Africa. It's actually a term that was coined in America because America has very similar social stratification like South Africa. And the social stratification is racial. Let's be frank about it. We're not going to beat around the bush today. So it's about white privilege and that this privilege has been maintained, but that at the dawn of democracy, in 1994, there were many promises of social transformation for the poor, and that the government policies were supposed to address this, but these promises were unfulfilled. Okay, so I've heard these slogans of, we were promised something, and then we were sold out. Okay, our parents were promised free education, we're here for the refund. Okay, and it's because, I'll show you some of these figures, people are frustrated with the pace of economic transformation in South Africa. So let's just think about some of the terms. The discourse is about inclusive growth. In other words, if we're talking about the fact that there's this 10% and this 90%, how do we include this 90% in the resource distribution of the country? I mentioned neoliberal policies. Neoliberal policies come from what is called the Washington Consensus. Why the Washington Consensus? Because in Washington, D.C., there's two institutions, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which have promoted these neoliberal policies, which essentially suggest that government must stay out and allow business to make the pie grow bigger, the economy grow bigger. And if the pie grows bigger, then the poor will also benefit. But the criticism against this is that this hasn't happened very often, right? So we're going to see in South Africa, inequality hasn't changed over time. So even though the economy grows, it doesn't necessarily help the poor, right? So should we then maybe move to what we call inclusive growth, and how do we formulate that? Then there's these trade-offs between equity and efficiency. Okay, so we could do a lot of redistribution, equity, right? So we make sure that the rich pay higher taxes, as was announced in the budget speech last week, so that we can spend more on uplifting the poor, right? That's equity. But then you'll immediately hear the objections that this is anti-efficiency, right? That all of a sudden what it means is if you're going to ask people to pay more taxes, especially companies, might they leave the country? And then the pie shrinks. Right? So there's a trade-off. There's this idea that you have one or the other, and that if you promote efficiency, it reduces equity, and if you promote equity, it reduces efficiency. Yes. Then we have jobless growth, and particularly, as we're going to discuss, in South Africa, this really strange thing happened after 1994. After 1994, the economy started growing. The pie got bigger. But did our unemployment rate decline? No, it went exactly the opposite. It went up, which makes no sense whatsoever. Okay, how can an economy grow and not generate jobs? And a lot of this has to do with how you generate that economic growth. Is it with workers or is it with capital? And should we have the one or the other? Should we use machines and technology? Or should we actually employ workers who need that livelihood, right? And another defining term is the dual economy. And it's really epitomized by that 90-10 split that I was speaking about, right? We could characterize this in many other ways. We're going to discuss the formal and the informal. So the formal sector is somebody who's in a paid job, has a contract, works for a company that's very visible. But the informal sector is also an important component of the economy, except it's very low paying. In some senses, it's just an alternative to unemployment, right? It's a last resort option in South Africa. And I'm going to contrast that with other countries where it's a bit different, where the informal sector is actually a very integral part of the economy. So this is just to give you some buzzwords to hold on to when we talk. So let's show you some figures. I'm an economist, so I talk in pictures and numbers. I hope if you want me to slow down, please do so. So this is the latest shock figures. And I said we're not going to shy away from talking about race because it's a reality in our economy. I sometimes get accused of talking about race, but we have to in a country such as South Africa. Okay. So here we see it. If you look in that left-hand column, the average income of a white family annually, that's the average, is approximately 450,000 Rand per year. Okay. Compare that to a black family where it's just shy of 100,000 Rand per year. Okay. That's a differential of 5 times. So when we talk about economy and economic inequality, we're talking about really a separation between white and black. Okay. We have the Indian and the Asian population and the colored population somewhere in between. And this clearly speaks of the social injustices of apartheid. And apartheid wasn't just a social thing, it's clearly an economic thing, right? And the roots of that are many. It's rooted in the education system. It's rooted in land policies. It's rooted in the way we did development within cities in South Africa. It's rooted in the dual economy. And we're going to unpack this today. So in 2015, are we making progress? Well, yes, we are a little bit. Okay. So in 2015, the differential is 5 times between black and white. In 2008, it was 6 times. Okay. So it's small comfort that things are narrowing, the gap between the two race groups, but the gap is still huge. It's huge. Okay. So here I got some pictures from the internet. I don't know if you've seen these. If you could this is Hout Bay. And this shows you the spatial inequality in South Africa. Here you can see a vibrant picture of the dual economy. On the left, you have green leafy suburb with huge houses and lots of open space. 100 meters beyond, you have high dense housing, people living very close to each other, overcrowding, and living in poverty. Okay, so you know Hout Bay has been in the news quite a bit. Precisely because of this and because of the social conflict that has arisen between these two communities living together. Complete lack of integration between these two communities. Sometimes it's useful to see this visually because we often forget what this looks like. Okay, here's another one. And this shows you that it's not just between the very rich and the poor. Here we see actually, again, an informal settlement on the left. And on the right, we see government housing. So this is low-cost housing, and this is what you would call the RDP houses. You know about the RDP houses, the Reconstruction and Development Program. And here we see, even there's this big separation. So even though there's this progress for a very poor part of the population that is being uplifted, there's still a lot to do, as you can see on the left-hand side. Okay. You can go and check out that website for more, unequalscenes.com. It's quite a visual stimulation to make you think, right? To make you think, okay? So the one thing that I'd like to emphasize to you is there's a real disconnect between the big economy, the macro economy, so our GDP. GDP is what measures the value of production or the value of our total income in the economy, okay? And that's listed here on this left-hand axis, okay? And on the top axis, we have life expectancy. So as we can see, as this goes up, we see richer countries have higher life expectancy, right? And the pattern is pretty clear, right? Richer countries have big life expectancy. But here you can see who's sitting all on its own away from this line, South Africa, okay? On the one hand, we're a middle-income country, an upper-middle-income country, which means in the world rankings, we're not that bad off, right? Upper-middle-income country, which means, according to the World Bank, we're not far from, we could develop into a higher-income country if things were to go well, right? But we have this really low life expectancy, the socioeconomic outcome, what actually happens on the ground in terms of what people experience. So our life expectancy here just above 50 years, but people at our similar level of development have life expectancy of 70 to 75 years. So in essence, for our level of economic development, we're selling people short by about 20 years. Right? Now, this is just one example. I could put another indicator on there, and it would be true. Right? We would see that South Africa has this real disconnect between its overall development and what happens in households. And this really suggests to us that what's happening in the broader economy is not affecting people broadly. Right? The benefits of the economy at large aren't always reaching the average person. And so the question is, this disconnect, how do we solve it? And that's where we talk about inclusive economic growth. So let's delve a bit into the history, because it is important, okay? I'm actually only going to talk to you about 20th century history, but actually this started before then. So 1911 is the start of formal discrimination in South Africa, where we had what we call the Job Reservation or the Colour Bar Act. And it was called the Colour Bar because, as I said, the dual economy, there's this barrier. And there was literally this barrier. Some people could get this job, some people could get this job. White jobs were reserved for white people, black jobs were reserved for black people. And there was a big skills differential, right? So this has been going on for more than a century. Obviously, it was abolished prior to, just shortly after 1994. But this was institutionalized discrimination for a very long period. Then we follow up with another big one just 2 years later, in 1913, in the Land Act. And this is in big contention still today. On my way here, I was listening on the radio. In Parliament, they're going to discuss today to try and have the Constitution amended so that we can have land restitution without payment, right? So that land can be expropriated without compensation. In other words, for instance, somebody who has a farm, that farm gets taken away without people being refunded. The way land reform has worked in South Africa up to now is a willing buyer, willing seller option, so that farmers who are willing to sell their farms, the government pays them, and then that land gets redistributed to families whose descendants used to live there, right? But this is a very old act which is still contentious today, okay? Still contentious today, 104 years later. So essentially what it did is it gave 13% of South Africa's total area to 80% of the population. Black individuals were not allowed to farm outside of those boundaries. White individuals were allowed to. Okay, and this is why land is still such an emotional issue today. Even if people weren't necessarily going to go back and farm, it's still an important thing because it's something that was stolen, right? In that sense. And why is this so important? Well, if you compare us, and I'm going to show you some of these figures a little bit later, if you compare us to many other African economies, we have one defining feature, is that we have a very small smallholder sector in South Africa. In other words, people who farm for their own kitchens. In the rest of Africa, people are much more likely to farm to eat what they've planted themselves. In South Africa, we don't have that anymore because of what we see here. Okay, so only 2.5 million households today do any form of home production. Now you might say to me, but gee, that's so old-fashioned, right? We're a modern economy. Who still wants to till the soil for livelihoods, right? The point is we've had 100 years where this would have been the norm and that was removed. And people were forced to find another livelihood, but those opportunities weren't necessarily available. The other important bit is the 1950 Group Areas Act. And that didn't just separate urban-rural. Within urban areas, there was a separation. Black people could live there, white people could live there. Okay. What was the effect of that? Right, so this is what was called grand apartheid. So it's the segregation of cities. And here again, it had an important economic consequence, very similar to the Land Act. Right? So in particular, what it did was it thwarted informal sector activity. We spoke about the dual economy previously. But informal activity is typically, you could think of this as a spaza shop, right? Or somebody selling goods next to the road. Now, the Group Areas Act suggested that you cannot, as a black person, move into an urban area and sell your goods. So you weren't part of the mainstream economy, even as part of the informal sector. Now, again, just as with subsistence farming, in most other African economies, the informal sector is very important to people's livelihoods. If you don't find a formal job, you generally make it work for yourself. You create self-employment. And this has been limited very greatly in South Africa. So there's this term coined by a World Bank economist, informal is normal. Informal is normal. Because it's true, in many Asian and African countries, informal employment is the norm. Now again, we might think, gee, isn't informality something we should we don't want to have an informal sector because it's such a poor livelihood, people can't live off it. The point is, in many countries, people do live off it. But it's an opportunity which has been removed in South Africa. So again, some pictures. This is what the Group Areas Act did to Cape Town, and this is in 2011. The white dots, the purple dots is where primarily white people live. The blue dots is where black people live, and the orange dots is where colored people live. Very clear separation. And do you see in the top left there by the harbor where the CBD is, where the main economic hub is? People are living very far away from there. And this is, spatial inequality is a very important hindrance to people being able to create their own livelihoods. Okay? So if you live far away from the economic activity and it takes you maybe 2-3 hours to get to a job, it might not be worth your while getting that job because of transport costs, right? Transport costs to get to jobs are particularly high in South Africa, and commute times are particularly high in South Africa. So if you're commuting very far to get to a low-paying job, it might not be worth your while. This is Joburg, the same map, and we see Joburg. It's much the same, right? Much the same. So these very distinct separations that were enforced in history. So in 1991, some of these acts were abolished. That was shortly after the negotiated settlement, even before the first elections in 1994. So legislatively, this was the end of spatial segregation. It was the end of discrimination. But the point is, we've been into just more than 20 years of democracy, and what we're going to see is that a lot of these things haven't changed. And if a lot of these things haven't changed, it does contribute to social conflict. So here are some more graphs, and I'm going to illustrate that to you. In the top left graph, that's a generational perspective, right? So it shows you how education has expanded. And what you can see is people born in the 1940s, and this is particularly for the black African population, didn't have a lot of education. People born in the 1990s have 8 years more education than people born in the 1940s. This is fantastic, right? It actually means that socioeconomically people should have progressed, because we often hear this story that education is the key to progressing economically. Okay, education is key. It's such an important socioeconomic policy. It actually opens the doors for people to get jobs. It opens the doors for people to move ahead, right? To move ahead. But what has happened? Here we see this is what people say about have they moved ahead or not. And we see that actually people born in 1940 think they've moved ahead much more than people in the year 2000. And that's these same people who've got all of this extra education. There's clearly something amiss here. There's some sort of mismatch here. People moving ahead so quickly, this is unprecedented, right? 8 years of education in 2 generations. That's incredible. That's progress. But clearly people have no idea and say, no, there's no progress. Why? Well, here we see that the labor market is important. And when I say the labor market, I mean jobs. And we see that jobs, it's just completely flat. People haven't had a greater probability of finding a job despite being much better equipped to have a job. So there's clearly some sort of mismatch happening here.